All right. So, welcome back to part two. Right now, we'll turn attention to Charles de Sucandat, uh, the Baron de Montesquieu, or better known as Montesquieu. Montesquieu himself was a member of the French nobility. He studied the classics and law, and in 1721, he is going to publish one of his better known works, known as the Persian Letters. This was a work in which two fictitious Persians, again, kind of engage in conversation, critiquing Persian institutions. Again, institutions that closely paralleled French institutions of the early 18th century when Montesquieu is writing this work, this book. In it, Montesquieu calls for religious toleration. He denounced institutions like slavery, and he argued for using reason to liberate human beings from prejudice. He also attacked the kind of the more traditional expressions of religion itself. So again, Montesquieu is really kind of going for the jugular here as far as experiences within his native France, but doing so in a more kind of indirect or circuitous way to get around censorship and things of that nature. Later on, Montesquieu would go on in 1748 to publish The Spirit of the Laws. This was a comparative study of governments, kind of a foray into examining natural laws as they applied to governing society itself. And as Montesquieu came to, or as he saw it, there were three basic types of government: republics, which kind of had the benefit of broad public or facilitating broad public participation. But he argued that because of that, republics themselves were usually small in scale or in domain. Now, he was going on what he knew and kind of the experiences that he was observing at the time, namely the Dutch Republic, which was small in geographic kind of domain. The second basic type was that of monarchies as far as governing styles or institutions. He says that in a republic, or excuse me, in a monarchy, this is a governing system that is dominated by the ruling elites, and that they could achieve, in many cases, a medium scale or domain. So you aren't as beholden to um, having to synthesize a large number of input, as you would in, say, a republic. And so, because of that, you're able to kind of listen to the elites of society, govern according to their interests. And as a result, because there are fewer elites, this means that there are fewer in a broader domain so that you can exert control over a larger swath of the face of the earth. And lastly, there was despotism, autocracy, rule by fear, um, which was, I mean, could be large scale in its domain. I mean, you didn't have to put up or listen to anyone's alternative perspectives or interests. That simply you were governing largely through the individual whim of an all-powerful central figure, an autocrat or an absolute monarch, say. And so, as a result, um, you know, the whim and the will of that individual, you didn't have to cater to any other inputs. And so, this meant that you could focus on imposing that one way of thinking and one set of interests across a much larger domain or scale as far as kind of um, geopolitics was concerned. For his part, Montesquieu praised England as being a moderate monarchy. Um, uh, kind of exhibiting and practicing various checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to provide for the greatest freedom, along with maintaining the greatest sense of security. When translated into English in 1750, this treatise, The Spirit of the Laws, had a profound effect on American colonists, specifically the likes of Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. And this kind of perspective, these ideas, these enlightened views, shared by Montesquieu in many respects, you know, were fundamental in influencing the construction and kind of the philosophical, um, political characteristics of the colonists themselves, how they began to view themselves, but then also, of course, in the American Revolution, how newly independent Americans were going to begin to govern themselves. Another key leading French intellectual and enlightened thinker was that of Francois Marie Arouet, or better known as Voltaire. That's the kind of alias that he used for himself. He came from the French middle class. He received a classical education in which he studied law, but he enjoyed his success as an adult as a playwright. He Voltaire lived in England for 2 years, in which he developed a great admiration for English life and culture. He really was taken with and an admirer of the freedom of the press that England exhibited for itself, the political freedoms that England had established, and also the high threshold, the high level of religious toleration. Voltaire believed that this resulted from the great diversity of religious communities that coexisted within England itself, which helped to reflect the tolerance, the religious tolerance itself in general, in response to more reasonable and cosmopolitan expressions of society in England. And again, now, he's looking at it from the far end, or from the kind of the outcome, you might say, of all the religious turbulence that had occurred within England. Things like the English Civil War and the back and forth kind of oscillations between Protestant and Catholic heads of state. He's benefiting from all of that kind of turbulence as England begins to settle down. Um, so um, keep that in mind, because that's where we're going to end when it comes to this lecture and kind of the early Enlightenment and its experiences. Because of this, because of his admiration of English culture and English politics and such, this is going to amplify his criticism of French intolerance and abuses. It gives him a direct um, uh, kind of example of an alternative to French absolutism. And one of the best examples that he saw of the tragedies and the kind of abuses taking place within the French absolutist state came in what's known as the Calais affair. To give some background here, John Calais was a French Protestant, and he was accused of killing his own son when the son wanted to convert to Catholicism. And John Calais confessed after being tortured, and he died a short time later. Now, Voltaire protested so strongly uh, to what had happened to John Calais that a retrial was ordered. And in that retrial, the father was posthumously exonerated, and that it was learned that the son had actually committed suicide. The whole tragic incident of this Calais affair, as it became known, demonstrated French society's religious problems. that a Protestant father in a predominantly Catholic country was tortured into admitting the killing of his own son, who sought to convert to Catholicism. Um, and coming out of all of this, you have a father and son both serving as victims of social inflexibility, that they were victims of the intolerance fostered by and within French society itself. And so this was the type of injustice, you might say, that Voltaire pointed to as an example of, kind of what was wrong with the French uh, society itself. And as you might expect, Voltaire didn't trust faith. Instead, he sought religious enlightenment through um, what was known as deism within the um, philosophes or among the philosophes and enlightened thinkers. This was this cultivated a belief in a Newtonian God, that they deists believed that God continued to exist, but that it was a rational, mechanical entity and creator. In essence, deists kind of perceived of God as being a clockmaker or a watchsmith, setting the world in motion, but not interfering with its operation and the natural laws that governed the running of the universe itself. And people could come to know God by knowing these natural laws. And so there's a very close association here between enlightened thinking and kind of religious enlightenment or epiphany. That when you were coming to study the operation of things, the laws that governed not only the motions of the heavens and the universe itself, but also the study of society and justice and politics and the like. This was in many cases trying to unlock the mysteries of kind of God's plan, you might say. And so many enlightened thinkers were deists. That Thomas Jefferson himself was a deist. So they don't see the pursuits coming out of the Enlightenment era as being in opposition to the kind of ideas of Christianity or this idea in a monolithic God. They actually see them as dovetailing quite nicely. So that's the nature of the relationship between enlightened thinkers and kind of that's this idea of spiritual satisfaction. Another leading philosopher was that of Denis Diderot. He was the son of a skilled craftsman in France. But in his adult life, Diderot became a freelance writer, which meant that he had to be well versed in many subjects and languages. Again, picking up work as a freelance writer wherever he could. And so his experiences here in that profession was valuable in his composing and editing his life's work, a 28-volume encyclopedia. This would be the first kind of universal encyclopedic work in the Western world. Now that comes centuries after the Jungla Encyclopedia, that we talked about in Lecture One, Week One, in China. So it gives you a sense of, the the experiences and the kind of focus, you might say, of um, the world and its various cultures. Now, what's interesting is that the Jungla Encyclopedia comes at a time when there is a good deal of what you might say is enlightenment in the Chinese experience, but that was fleeting. That was temporary. Here, at the time that Diderot is writing in the early to mid 18th century, it's in the heart of this enlightened era, and also an era that was going to be sustained and perpetuated. Again, like I said at the outset, very characteristic of how we come to know our own world today. All of this would give rise to a what can be described as, or is often described as, a new science of man. Um, Today, we describe this as the social sciences. This came about um, due in large part to the writings and teachings of David Hume, a Scottish philosopher. I believe he's on the next page. Yeah. He studied experiences of human life in order to understand human nature. We're also going to see other forays into things like economic philosophy. This is best seen with the writings and philosophy or teachings of Francois Quinet, um, a leader of the physiocrats who studied economic laws that governed humanity. In Quinet's estimation, it was ideas that land equaled wealth, and that land itself was the sole source of wealth because agriculture was the only true revenue that could be kind of uh, derived from or extrapolated from the land itself. What's interesting also is that Kine rejected mercantilist principles. The idea of the significance of money, of gold and silver that was in circulation. He also rejected pretty wholeheartedly the mercantilist ideas of controlling economies to the benefit of the state. Kine instead argued that people should be free to pursue their own economic self interests, which introduces the concept of laissez faire or laissez faire economics. The idea that instead of under the mercantilist system where the state and the economy should be synonymous and that there should be a very close relationship between the two, that instead the state should separate itself from the operations of economic life um, because state control or state interference or oversight would infringe on the freedom that people might have to pursue their own self interests when it comes to economic pursuits. That philosophy, laissez faire, is going to heavily influence the writings of perhaps what we might know to be a better known economist or economic philosopher, that being Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher, and he wrote his best known work, The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Oftentimes, this is kind of boiled down to, or kind of uh, um, uh, referred to as his book, The Wealth of Nations, which he wrote in 1776. And he draws the following conclusions in this very uh, this classic piece of economic literature or economic writing. First and foremost, he critiqued and criticized protective tariffs, arguing in many cases that this was a manifestation of mercantilist principles. Again, because he was an admirer of Quinet and these ideas of laissez faire, he believed that this was detrimental to economic operation. He was very much a free market kind of hands off approach to economic behavior, just letting economics, you know, dictate, uh, you know, people's self-interests when it came to their own wealth and their own kind of pursuit of wealth. He also identified labor as the true wealth of a nation. So he's moving away in many respects from Quinet's idea that land was the kind of criteria, the sole criteria for determining wealth. Instead, Smith says that it's what people do, the work that they can produce, that is going to determine one's uh, wealth or access to it. He Again, like Kine, as I mentioned, favored the limitation of government and government power when it came to economic matters. He believed that government should be relegated to overseeing or seeing to the national defense, to maintaining justice, and to maintaining public works, and that was it. Um, he believed that there was often this invisible hand that was at work within the economics and economic operations. That the convergence of people's self-interests and the overlapping of people's self-interest was the invisible hand that really kind of determined economic activity and economic um, uh, engagement and kind of coming together for purposes of economic benefit and exchange. All of this taken together is going to establish the core principles of what were better known as economic liberalism. And toward the latter part of the 18th century, laissez faire economics became the dominant economic philosophy. So, here in the economic sphere, we see this pivot from away from mercantilist kinds of principles towards laissez faire principles that people begin to say, that this is more of a classical expression of economic philosophy. That you know, economics was its own individual kind of um, not only subject but also kind of sphere, and as a result, it should be operate independently of any type of state interests. That it should be the sole expression and sole kind of domain of fulfilling self-interest. Now, for much of what we've discussed here, we've talked about kind of the this being a male-dominated sphere. That is for the Enlightenment as a whole. But the Enlightenment also afforded particular opportunities for women as well. Um, People like individuals like Diderot and Voltaire, for their part, advocated for equality of the sexes. And more importantly, women also during this period of time began to speak for themselves to a greater degree. Some of those individuals included the likes of Mary Astle, who called for equal opportunities for men and women when it came to education, or attaining an education. Um, Astle also called for equality within the institution of marriage itself. Traditionally, women became the property of their husbands, again, particularly under English law. If you recall the experiences of Margaret Broek, this Dutch settler in the New World who, had to reorient and pivot in her adult life when she became a subject of the British Crown, and falling under the jurisdiction of English law, which was not as generous or friendly towards women as it had been under Dutch law. Also, we have the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft, seen as the founder of modern European feminism. She pointed out the hypocrisies of the philosophes themselves in her probably best known work towards the close of the 18th century in what's known as the Vindication of the Rights of Women. She argued that women should have equal rights with men in economic and political lives, or matters. So, in many cases, women were really beginning to champion the idea of, self-interest, and in an era in which the Enlightenment was heavily steeped in this idea of fulfilling self-interest, whether it was self-interest in the economic sphere, self-enlightenment when it came to, becoming versed in the various ideas of that were being bandied about during the Enlightenment itself. Um, you know, Becoming advocating for a greater sense of self-empowerment in the public sphere when it came to politics. All of these things are going to kind of affect um, society as a whole, not just for men, but also, of course, here for women. And the Enlightenment in European society, for all its focus on liberty and equality, the movement remained most popular among the aristocracy and the upper middle class. Um, even between men and women, these are people that are, to a certain degree, well versed in. They have, kind of more classical educations, so they're bringing an educated perspective to what they're writing and reading. Um, and enlightened ideas circulated among what were known as salons. These were social occasions mixing philosophers, writers, artists, wealthy members of the bourgeoisie, the kind of upper middle class, government officials, members of the nobility in some cases as well. And what's interesting within these salons is that they were in many cases hosted by women. Um, so these opportunities allowed women to influence policy and decision making. That they had literally a front row seat to guest speakers coming into their homes, that would speak before a very kind of small, intimate audience. Um, to hear the writings or the ideas of philosophers like, Voltaire, among others. And this was, kind of attracted leading members of the Enlightenment, to their salons. That, excuse me, sorry, just peeking ahead. Um, the likes of Marie Therese de Givron or Marquis du Deffand, who were aristocratic women in charge of kind of social events and organizing social events within their own husbands' estates. But again, they were cultivating this sense of enlightened philosophy, the exchange of ideas through these salons. But then also they were there, uh, if not directly participating, then at the very least present, um, listening to the ideas of these enlightened thinkers. One of the most profound areas, and they're virtually all profound in many respects, whether we're talking about economics or kind of social theory or what have you. Um, there are also going to be pretty profound effects felt in the political sphere. This is where we turn attention towards the writings of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, two of the leading members, more distinguished members, you might say, of political philosophy during this period of time. John Locke was an English, highly educated, kind of upper middle class individual, and he wrote several key works. I'm going to talk about his essay concerning human development. We'll turn attention towards, and I'll kind of sketch out some general outlines of the two treatises of civil government. But I'll really kind of drill down on that when I talk about the Glorious Revolution, which will round out this lecture. I see that I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to stop here before we get into John Locke and Rousseau, so we have full time to talk about it. Okay, I'll be right back.